This is the web transmission service of the Royal Canadian Military Institute, returning to you with our first virtual military history night since the COVID pandemic lockdown began on the 16th of March. We are very pleased to welcome the Archivist of the Canadian National Exhibition, Alicia Cherayil, who describes the close relationship between the CNE and the Canadian military from the exhibition's foundation in 1879.
The dark clouds far away.
Before introducing our guest speaker, I would like to acknowledge the behind-the-scenes RCMI team, who together with our speaker and Danielle Bourre, CNE Program Manager Entertainment, made this event possible. RCMI President Mike Hoare, Zoom host and RCMI General Manager Garrett Wright, Sylvia Lau, Zoom Coordinator and Event Sales Manager, Eric Morse, Members News Editor and Director of Publications, Catherine Ely, Communications Director, and Jim Lutz, our Social Committee Chair. Thank you all. Our speaker tonight is Alicia Cherayil, and the topic, The X Goes to War. Since joining the product development team in 2010, Alicia has been involved in curating original style exhibits, hosting traveling exhibits, coordinating walking tours, facilitating participation of social arts and heritage groups to public outreach of the CNE. In 2014, Alicia took management of presentation projects for the CNE archive, including digitalizing 100,000 cellulose acetate negatives in order to be made accessible to the public. Alicia now manages all aspects of the CNE archives. Since incorporation in 1879, the CNE has been intimately tied with the military. This talk will showcase images and artifacts from the CNE extensive archival collection, the Warriors' Day Parade, exploring the uses of the grounds and buildings during the First and Second World Wars, and the relationship between the military and the CNE today. So without further ado, a warm welcome, and I now turn the meeting over to you, Alicia. Over to you, Alicia.
All right, thank you so much, Pat. So just bear with me for one moment. I'm just going to get my screen up. So good evening, everyone, and thank you to the RCMI and Pat and the entire team for having me here tonight. As mentioned, my name is Alicia Cherayil, and I'm the Program Manager for Arts and Heritage, as well as the Archivist for the Canadian National Exhibition. Just a little background, the Sini archives were actually established in the mid-1960s to be a repository for the institutional memory of the Canadian National Exhibition, mostly of the event itself, but actively collects relevant material related to the Canadian International Air Show, the Warriors' Day Parade, our parent body, the Canadian National Exhibition Association and its foundation. But it wasn't really actually until the 1980s and maybe the 90s when the archives actually took shape and became more formalized. And a lot of that work was done by my predecessor, the previous archivist, Linda, who some of you might actually know. So I'm super grateful to her and their entire team for recognizing and advocating for our history. So we're just going to jump right in. For the next, I'd say 20-25 minutes or so, I'm just going to give you a small glimpse into the CNE's archival collection through the lens of the CNE's military connections. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about political implications or the wars in general, as I have a feeling that many of you watching know more about this than I do. Rather, I'd like to talk about objects and photos from our collection that are relevant to the topics that you can see on the screen right now. So we're going to focus mostly on the pre-wars, First and Second World War, military displays, and of course the Warriors' Day Parade. It's not going to be an in-depth talk. It's more broad. I thought it would be interesting to just kind of do a skim of some of these topics. And at the end of the talk, during question and answers, we'll have opportunities to talk a little bit more. As well, I'll tell you two ways for you to access our collection online, so you can do your own research. I'm actually going to start, though, with a little background history about the fair, just to get us all onto the same page. So stemming from an even earlier history of provincial agricultural fairs, which traveled from city to city. Toronto, for example, hosted in 1852, and you can see an example of the grounds map there on the left, and as well in 1878, which you can see the illustrations. It was also in 1878 when the Crystal Palace was built, which was our original main exhibition building. It was, of course, modeled after the Crystal Palace in London. You can see some sketches and some photos of it here. It was originally built actually more north of the grounds, kind of where CAMH is, but it was moved to its final location prior to the start of the fair. If you're familiar with the CNE grounds, it stood roughly where the current horticultural building is, which was built, of course, in 1907 to replace the Crystal Palace, which burnt down in 1906. It wasn't until 1879 that the city really decided it wanted to be the permanent home of this traveling fair. But after an unsuccessful bid to host in 1879, and based on the fact that they had already built some permanent exhibition buildings, the city decided to go on its own. And the Toronto Industrial Exhibition, or TIE, was officially incorporated in March of 1879. It was, of course, later renamed the Canadian National Exhibition, or CNE, as we all refer to it, in 1912, to better reflect its place as a show window of the nation and promote agriculture industry, manufacturing, and the arts. The Canadian National Exhibition is actually incorporated under two provincial acts, the CNEA Act and an Agricultural Societies Act. We are an agricultural society at our heart. And as of 2013, the CNE is an independent, self-sustaining, not-for-profit with no annual municipal, provincial, or federal funding, but that still promotes agriculture, industry, manufacturing, and the arts. We are the largest community festival in Canada, and based on who you talk to, we're the 5th or 6th in North America. But the historic grounds that have been the home of the CNE have an even older military connection. On the west end of the grounds stands an impressive obelisk dedicated to Fort Rouet, or Fort Toronto, as it's also known. The fort was built by the French government as a fortified trading post in 1749. After a decade of success as a fur and pelt trading post and fortification against attacks, during the 7-Year War in 1759, the French burnt Fort Rouet in order to keep it from the English. Interestingly, around the monument is a sidewalk which outlines the position of the walls of the fort. To me, it's a must-see when you're on the grounds. You can see the sidewalk that I'm talking about in that photo on the right. Fun fact, there used to be 2 cannons, as you can see in that middle image, on either side of that obelisk. But with some research, it was actually determined that the cannons were English and therefore not in line with the historical context of the monument, and they were removed and transferred over to Fort York. The 1,000 acres of the Garrison Common, or Reserve, were set aside as an area to be fortified to help in the defense of the town of York, aka Toronto. With Fort York as the main defense stronghold, but the unfortunate outcome of the Battle of York, which of course took place in April of 1813, a new fort was commissioned on what is now the southeast end of the CNE grounds. What you're looking at now is a portion of a model diorama set that was transferred to us from the city archives. It's a diorama model of the Battle of York from a display that was at the CNE in 1979. The whole set is in multiple pieces and unfortunately in pretty rough shape. The mini soldiers that you can see in the center, we actually believe are made of lead paint. So we are actually currently looking for a new home to deaccession this whole set. What is now referred to as Stanley Barracks, originally the officer quarters of the only remaining building of the original new fort construction. The new fort was constructed by the Royal Engineers of the British Army in 1841 and originally consisted of 6 main stone buildings around a parade square. It was in 1893 when it became known as Stanley Barracks. The barracks have had many uses, from 1884, when the infantry school was open there, until the First World War, when the Canadian military, infantry, and cavalry schools made their home there. It was also the training space for the Northwest Mounted Police, or as we now know them, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. And as a side note, the mounted unit of the Toronto Police still is stationed on the grounds in the Horse Palace. We'll get into more uses about the grounds as a whole during the Great Wars, but other high-level uses of the barracks include temporary holding facility for internees later transported to prisoner of war camps in Northern Ontario from 1914 to 1916. It was the home for the Canadian Women's Army Corps during the Second World War. And in 1947, it was actually converted into post-war emergency housing. Between 1951 and 1953, 5 of the buildings were torn down. Canada's Sports Hall of Fame moved in 1955, and then the Marine Museum of Upper Canada utilized the space between 1959 and 1998. It was at that point that the building closed to the public. Currently, the barracks are amid renovation and are part of the Hotel X Corporation. I'm not personally sure what the final plans are for the space, but there was talk that of it becoming public space again. If you visit the area, you can actually see some of the foundational remains of another building as part of the hotel construction, as you can see in this photo on the right beside the glass walkway. Another aspect we're often asked about is the gates. The ones you see in the image on the left are actually a scale reproduction. The original gates are in Guildwood and actually went through a significant preservation project a few years ago. The inclusion of military programming was always an important part of the event since the inception of the Toronto Industrial Exhibition. As the TIE and now CNE was and reflects the greater societal and economic local and world views, it is not surprising that there was such a significant connection between the military and the CNE. As a showcase, it was a perfect medium to highlight and support military engagement and education. Later, during the war years, it was a tangible connection to serving officers to their families. In the early times, it showcased military prowess and might and were the focus of the programming. In 1882, a special grand practical illustration of modern warfare, the use of torpedoes was shown on the lake, showcasing how the firing and explosion of shells would demonstrate, quote, blowing to atoms of a large vessel. The drill was run by the Royal Military College at Kingston and Major Gray's Toronto Field Battery of Artillery. In the early years, grand military spectacles, or history pageants, were reenacted on the grandstand with casts of hundreds. Histories were told through song and dance in elaborate sets for large audiences over the run of the event. This ad from the 1888 program showcases the stage show The Siege of Sevastopol, which included a large firework display. The show was a historical lesson through theatrical exposition of this siege, which actually happened between 1854 and 1855 as part of the larger Crimean War. Demonstrations of military equipment and drills were also a crowd favorite. These excerpts from the 1909 Program of Special Attractions showcases a myriad of military events, 2 of which are the exploding of submarine mines, showcasing the strength of the Navy, and, in conjunction with the militia, a model military camp featuring infantry, cavalry, artillery, engineers, intelligence corps, and the Army Medical Corps. In addition to the hospital on site, the Band of the Royal Regiment of Kingston was also featured to provide daily concerts. I know I do not need to get into the background information about the First World War for this group, or its significant impact on Canada as a member of the Commonwealth. As we all know, everyone wanted to do their part, and the CNE was no different. The grounds were converted to an extensive military encampment and training space referred to as Exhibition Camp. Buildings were converted to military use, and the CNE, which still ran during the First World War, became a space for military exposition and recruitment. Training demonstrations provided a tangible experience for visitors to see what recruits were going to be facing. So for example, in that inset photo, you see some officers doing some calisthenics training, and off in the distance there was benches and seats put out for CNE guests to watch them do these drills. A small but great collection of photo negatives were actually donated to the archives in 2004 from Mary Coote. 30 images taken by her father, James A. Coote, from his time at exhibition camp during the First World War. Coote was born and raised in Oakville, Ontario, and after graduating from McGill University in 1913 with a degree in electrical engineering, he worked at Canadian Westinghouse, but that closed during the war. In his own words, quote, "After bumming around for a while, I went into the YMCA canteen in the military camp in Toronto exhibition grounds. The pay was only minimal, and in the spring, when the camp broke up, I got a job with the government inspecting cordite at Noble," end quote. Later, in 1917, Coote joined the Faculty of Engineering at McGill and remained there for the rest of his career. Most of the photos you will see over the next couple of slides are from his collection. They provide a very small glimpse of what the buildings and grounds look like during this time and the types of activities that took place. So here we have some drills as well as the mess hall and the canteen. As we continue to move through these next few slides, you can start to see that daily life at exhibition camp and how it was integrated into the exhibition grounds. This shot in front of the old flyer, predecessor to the roller coaster you're probably thinking of, is in my opinion an iconic representation of the merging of the two worlds. Here we have some postcards sent from exhibition camp. The top left is from Joe to his parents asking if they can visit on his day off. The one on the right is to his brother asking if everything is okay and how he's doing. As I alluded to earlier, the CNE remained operational during the First World War. Between 1914 and 1918, over 4.3 million people visited the CNE, which when you think about how the population of Toronto was around 470,000 people in 1914, that is a significant number of visitors to the grounds. Here we have some crowd shots from 1914 on the left and 1915 on the right, and the old Dufferin Gate. Here we have a 1916 weapons display explaining the importance of manufacturing. Munitions were an important part of the war effort, and Canadians did their part. During the First World War years, we have 3 program covers that cover 1914, 1915, and 1918. Artwork during the early fair years was actually commissioned and utilized in multiple forms, from marketing ads to the program covers as you see here. Fun fact, in 1919, the program artwork was actually created by J.E.H. MacDonald, one of the founding members of the Group of 7. The image on the right is a colorized reproduction from a photo of His Royal Highness the Prince of Wales from his visit to the CNE in 1919. He stood in review of large military parade as well as opened the CNE. This item was then reproduced onto a postcard which you could buy at the fair. Here are some additional scenes from the fairs during those years. Our earlier images are not as well dated, so it is more of a circa time frame I was looking at. But what you do see is generally typical of the fair of that time period. In the years prior to the CNE's closure for the Second World War, so we're looking at images from 1939 to 1941 on the screen right now, the connection between the military and the CNE took on a slightly different approach. The focus on celebrating the troops and recruitment seemed to prevail, and the launch of the Warriors' Day Parade formally in 1921, more on that later, is a prime example of that. Although, of course, prior to that date, military parades were also a feature at the fair. It was clear that commemoration and recognition of those who served was and still continues to be an important part of the CNE's history. This program cover from 1940 and 1941 again celebrates those who served, mirroring messaging between years. During the years, troops stationed on the grounds were temporarily relocated, but the remaining officials helped to continue to provide opportunities for fair guests to experience the strength of the Canadian military and displays of military technology, including armored vehicle demonstrations. I'm going to now just play a short piece from one of our archival films that was commissioned for the 1941 CNE. I'll warn you that the audio is quite scratchy and not that clear, but to me it's a neat part of our history.
Great annual pageant of progress. Exhibition visitors in 1941 saw Canada in arms, saw the boys in navy blue and the boys in cocky battle dress. In the gravest hour that the world has known, these and the boys of the Royal Canadian Air Force were the truest symbols of Canada's answer to the call of liberty and the Empire.
The fair became a place to learn more about the evolving conflict. Victory bond drives, as seen in the photo here, and enlistment booths were also quite prevalent. But as Canada joined the conflict, it was clear that more work on the home front was needed. The Department of National Defense put in a notice that the grounds were required year-round, and the board of the CNE voted unanimously to make this happen. The 1942 CNE was cancelled for the first time in its history. It remained closed through the full duration of the war, and between 1945 and 1946, it functioned as a demobilization center for returning soldiers, and also during 1946, the military moved off the grounds, which allowed the fair to reopen in 1947. This article from the Globe and Mail, which was recently shared with us from a longtime CNE supporter and historian, Mike Filey, is a great snapshot of that cancellation. So what was happening on the grounds during this time? Much like the First World War, multiple branches of the military set up camp on the grounds. But now all the buildings, large and small, were being utilized. In 1939, the Royal Canadian Air Force moved into the CNE Coliseum. The Canadian Army took over the Horse Palace, the CNE administrative offices, and the government building. And the Royal Canadian Navy converted the automotive building into the HMCS York, which is the photo you see on the screen now. As I mentioned earlier, in 1941, the Canadian Women's Army Corps took over Stanley Barracks. An interesting use of the Horse Palace was as temporary housing. Stalls were converted to bunks and soldiers left their marks. These photos show some of the engravings that can be found in the building. By the time the war ended, it was estimated around 12,000 members of the military were stationed at exhibition camp, mostly in administrative roles. Around 300,000 were also temporarily billeted at exhibition camp, getting some basic training before being sent overseas. In 1947, when the CNE reopened, the celebration was well received by the community, with over 2.3 million people visiting the fair that year. The War Trophies Victoire exhibit, which was traveling across the world, also made a stop at the 1947 CNE. Of note on display was Adolf Hitler's car, as seen in this postcard from the fair. As I mentioned, throughout the First World War and prior to the Second World War, military displays were a strong feature of the fair. And while the switch to war trophies after the Second World War took a slightly different approach, to this day, military displays are still an important part of the CNE, showcasing the latest and greatest in military technology. And recruitment are the two main themes that can be seen throughout the decades. While engagement in physical demonstration in military weapons, like in the later part of the 1880s and the early 1900s, is not as prevalent, during things like the Canadian International Air Show, which typically takes place over our Labor Day weekend, warplanes and jets are often a feature of the show. Dioramas were popular in the 1950s, whereas today, interactive and engaging exhibits are much more prevalent. Military entertainment has always been a staple of the CNE, and to this day continues to be. Military bands have been a great addition to the musical lineup at the fair. Constructed in 1936 and modeled after the famous Hollywood Bowl, the CNE bandshell was erected to provide additional concert space on the west end of the grounds. In the early years, the bandshell featured various military bands, but as time progressed, it featured fashion shows, the opening ceremonies, variety shows, and today it serves as the main concert venue of the annual fair. Famous politicians, military figures, and musical acts have all performed on this stage. The Royal Marines Military Band, seen here on the left, performed at the Bandshell in 1959, and international military bands have also performed at the X, including the Gurkhas and the Royal Fiji Military Band, both in 1975, which you can see on the right. The Scottish World Festival Tattoo was a large feature at the CNE Grandstand for about a decade, around 1972 to 81. It featured a large contingent of performers. Tattoos were and still are important displays of military and musical performance. The event at the Grandstand, which was seen by tens of thousands of guests over the years, featured a range of performances including large military bands and military rides. And speaking of military rides, they have been a feature of the fair for decades. Here we have the Royal Canadian Dragoons, circa early 1900s, and our own Royal Canadian Mounted Police. They have performed here on multiple occasions. The image included is from the 1973 CNE. Recognized military officials became head of the opening ceremonies and honored guests of the fair. Lord Baden-Powell on the left welcomed guests to the 1955 fair, while the Earl of Mountbatten visited in 1959. He both opened the fair and stood in review at the Warriors' Day Parade. It was his second visit to the fair, his first actually being in 1948. American actor-comedian Bob Hope performed multiple times at the CNE Grandstand, but in conjunction with the military, he took his show on the road. Hope, who was known for famously entertaining the troops, especially during the Second World War, took great lengths to bring some levity to the front, giving back in the best way he could. During one of his trips to Toronto to perform at the Grandstand, he took a side trip up to Camp Borden to entertain the officers there, taking photos with soldiers and other officials. And as we're off a little bit on tangent, I want to go a little bit further. The fair has a myriad of offerings: shopping, weird and wacky foods, shows, exhibits, rides, and games. The carnival component of the fair has been an integrated part of the X since almost its very beginning. Here we have an early human-powered Ferris wheel from the late 1880s and a precursor to the modern roller coaster from 1902. But games, those simplistic yet challenging midway games which provide hours of entertainment and often lighten your wallet, which is usually worth it after you walk away with that giant stuffed animal. But much like the fair of today changes its pricing to reflect what's popular, so like Minions or Pokemon, the CNE of yesterday offered other things, from live poodles to plastic dolls. But it was actually shortly after the Second World War that this item made it to the Midway. This artifact, which was donated by the previous archivist's brother, as you can see, this gas mask has seen better days, although never used for its intended purpose, thankfully. It is one of the more unique artifacts from our archival collection. Established formally in 1921, the Warriors' Day Parade has become one of the most poignant moments of the annual CNE. A celebration of veterans and the active enlisted, the parade really showcases the shared community across all forms of military. The Volunteer Council, who arranges the parade in conjunction with CNE staff, Danielle, are a dedicated group of people who ensure the solemnity, ritual, and commemoration is memorable and pays proper respect to all who participate and enjoy it. We don't have a lot of content from the early days of the parade, but I have pulled some images from the event over the decades. As you can see, the route was amended a few times with the placement of the review station moving in recent years to closer to the Prince's Gates, but for many years it was actually at the Grandstand. Although we will not have a parade this year, next year the Parade Council continues to work towards their 100th anniversary, which will take place in 2021. As I have said, the military is still connected with the CNE, from the interactive displays they include every year, to the participation in the Canadian International Air Show, to the Warriors' Day Parade. Celebrating, commemorating, and education about Canada's military and military history is an important part of public engagement and education. As we move forward, I believe we should always be aware and remember the sacrifices made by the brave men and women of our armed services and the ancillary businesses that keep us and everyone safe and free. I think as long as there is a CNE, there will be some kind of military collaboration at the X. And now I want to just take a moment to thank you all for listening to me ramble on. If you want to see more images from our collection, there are two great resources to check out. Our curated history page, which is at CNEheritage.com, where you can see around 100 years of CNE history organized by decade or theme. Or you can search our full archival database, which can be found on thex.com under the History tab in the footer of the page. I hope you all continue to be healthy and safe, and I hope to see you all at the 2021 CNE. So at this time, we can open up to questions. I'm just going to switch us over to gallery view. So if anybody has a question, you can either unmute yourself, or in the chat box, you can type your question into the chat box. So yeah, so if anybody has any questions.
I could put one, Alicia. It's Bob Kennedy here of the Fife and Drum.
Oh, excellent.
The July issue of the Fife and Drum actually is going to have a large article by Donald Graves, the military historian, about the 1919 CNE.
Okay.
And we're still looking actually for final totals of attendance that year. But the interesting question is about the German U-boat. It was promised on the poster that you showed us, but we know it never showed up. Do you know what happened?
I don't know specifically what happened. I think it was part of the programming lineup, and then something went awry. I can definitely check. I believe we have the annual report for 1919, so I can make a note of that and see if I can pull that out next time I can get into the archives.
Well, there's an interest. The newspaper coverage of the luncheon on the final day of the CNE is pretty good. The speaker was A.G. Doughty, the Dominion Archivist, who had been responsible for pulling in all of the war trophies, including the plan for the U-boat. And he made a point during the luncheon of apologizing for the U-boat not showing up. And he said it was an official mistake, and he was going to track down who made that mistake. Wow.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me. That's a significant item to make it out to Toronto. But yeah, I could definitely take a look and see if there's anything in our notes or in the minutes of our collection.
Thank you.
No problem. Anybody else?
Alicia?
Yes?
You were talking about the CNE in 1919. And of course, that was during the Spanish flu pandemic.
Yes. Yeah.
What was the role of the CNE during that pandemic? Because most of the military hospitals were chock full.
We don't have a full story of what our role was during that particular outbreak. We do know that the CNE suffered quite a reduced attendance for that year. We actually have more information on the polio epidemic from 37. They really outlined what happened during the X during 37 in the annual report. But 1919, I think they were still kind of getting over the wartime losses, and then the polio epidemic kind of hit at the same time. So it's kind of, I think, just like today, the CNE is kind of a meeting point for people. So I'm sure there was some education from the health department that was available. I know there was a lot of ads about, kind of similar to what we're going through right now with COVID, about, covering your mouth when you cough and washing your hands. So I know some of that messaging probably made it onto the grounds as well.
Actually, Alicia, I could add to that.
Sure.
For Donald's article, I've read all the newspaper coverage in the Star and the Globe, and it was remarkable to see that there was not a hint of any precautions about the flu, not mentioned in any of the articles, and the crowd that showed up for the Prince of Wales opening it was like a record-sized crowd.
Yeah.
And it's remarkable how the subject of the flu was completely absent from any of the coverage that we could read.
Wow. That's kind of surprising, but also not surprising. I feel like people sometimes avoid mentioning the bad things that are happening. So I'm seeing a couple questions in the chat, so I'm just going to answer a couple of them. So one of them is, what is the reason for the CNE's current location in Toronto? We were granted this parcel of land for the exhibition in 1878, 79, and it's just been our parcel of land that we've operated on. It is now managed by the city, so the CNE is actually a tenant of the ground, so we pay rent to do our event there. So I hope that answers that question. And then somebody's asking for more information about the French fort that I'm not going to say because I know Danielle is going to correct my pronunciation again. Yeah, there's a lot of research on the fort. Heritage Toronto actually has, I think, 2 or 3 plaques there, and a lot of that information is online. So if you just type in Fort Toronto or Fort Rouet, sorry, you can definitely find some more information about that there. We personally don't have a lot. We know what we know based on some archaeological digs that were done as a greater project around the Bandshell area through Exhibition Place. So Exhibition Place, which actually has their own archives, might have some more information. But yeah, there's definitely a ton of information online on that.
Actually, the latest from about Fort Rouet was Carl Benn.
Yeah,
Summarized all of his research in an article April 2018, again in the Fife and Drum.
Yeah.
But it's everything Carl Benn knows about it is in the article.
Yeah, I think a lot of the research we actually have on site is probably from Carl Benn as well.
And you helped us with that article too.
All right, awesome. All right, just checking. Anybody else have a question?
Alicia?
Yes.
I'm Mort Lightstone. I'm a past president of the Warriors Day Parade.
Oh, excellent.
I just wanted to thank you for an excellent presentation.
My pleasure.
You uncovered some very interesting points and some great photographs. So thanks for what you put together. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you. Somebody's asking if the archives are an exhibit anywhere or is there a museum at all? Unfortunately, no. Our archives, the CNE archives, are not accessible to the public except by appointment. We have a very, very small space at Exhibition Place that we rent out, which is our workspace where we actually do our preservation projects as well as our storage space. So unfortunately, it's not that accessible. What we do is stuff like this, where we go and give presentations. And every year at the fair, we try and do at least one exhibit that features some part of the archives collection. We currently, well, it was open, but it won't be open anymore because everything's closed, is the Withrow Common is our art gallery. So we have a collection of artwork up there. But as I mentioned, you can actually search our collection online. And the CNE Heritage website is really a great resource as well.
Hi, Alicia. It's Keith Harding calling.
Hi.
I want to thank you very much. Really enjoyed it. A couple of really interesting sidebar stories around some of the areas you touched on. And one of which, of course, with the recent death of Vera Lynn and her appearances at the Scottish World Festival.
Yep.
I mean, wonderful, wonderful connection to World War II stories. Also, after World War II and during the demobilization, there was a period of time where it got pretty raucous on the grounds as the returning troops were left there a little bit longer than they really wanted to be.
Yeah.
And the local media called them riots. I'm not sure they were, but things got pretty out of hand for quite a number of weeks, apparently. And anyways, they're just great side-by stories to what you were talking about.
For
Thank
sure.
you for your work tonight.
Oh, thank you. We had a question come in about the Girl Guides and Boy Scouts and if they were involved in any of the wartime efforts between the First or Second World War. I don't know specifically. I know that the Scouts have been on site for decades. I haven't personally done a lot of research about their involvement at the fair, but cadet reviews have been kind of a staple at the fair for decades, like into the earliest times of the Scouts. So unfortunately, I don't know that exact answer. Sorry. Oh, were there ever any military medical facilities? Yes, actually. Yeah, we had a hospital and a first aid on site pretty much every year. At times, it was actually run by the military, and then at other times, St. John's Ambulance and other institutions would come in. But yeah, we've always had some kind of medical facility. Now, obviously, it's the paramedics and fire that are on site. But yeah, we used to have military hospitals on site.
Well, thank you very much, everybody.
All right.
Thank you, Alicia, for a really spectacular presentation. Now, at this time, I usually present you with a thank you gift from RCMI. However, that's virtually impossible at the moment. I will make sure you have a real gift in the real world forthcoming. And thank you very much. I do have an announcement to make before ending this meeting. A second and third virtual presentation are scheduled. July 22nd, speaker Ryan Stackhouse and his topic, Enemies of the People, Hitler's Critics and the Gestapo. August 19th, our own resident expert on all things Roman, Eric Morse, and his topic, The People Are Revolting, AD 238, the Praetorians and Protesters. And now with that, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your participation, and I now declare this meeting ended. I hope to see you again. Thank you.
We'll meet again. Don't know where, don't know when, but I know we'll meet again some sunny day. Keep smiling through, just like you always do, till the blue skies and the dark clouds far away. So won't you please say hello to the folks that I know.